Dear and respected friend, thank you so much for your kind support and joining today's talk. I think Professor Anitra, Madam, has also joined. So we are going to start today's session with an invocation of a song on climate change. So let me share the screen. Thank you so much for your kind attention. And thank you so much for joining today's session. And today is a very special day because we are talking and we are discussing a very important topic of human concern. Dear and respected friend, I would like you to kindly mute yourself so that we can avoid disruptions. Yes, thank you so much. I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, on behalf of School of Humanities and Social Science of Raffles University, I welcome you. I also welcome you on behalf of SOHSS Chakra, Circle for Creative Co-Learning, Biswanadan Center for Asian Blossom It is a great pleasure and indeed an honor to have available to us distinguished speakers, Professor John Clammer from Jindal Global University, Sonepat, India, who will be delivering his talk on the very topic, Challenge of Climate Change, Paris Accord, COP26 and beyond. We are also joined by Professor Anitra Thorhaug, research scientist from School of Forestry and Environmental Studies from very famous Yale University. She is also US Club of Rome member. She will be delivering her talk on the very topic, ecosystem regeneration, why, how, where, who, how much. We are very grateful to our honorable speakers to accept our invitation. I welcome Professor Kumar Giri from Madras Institute of Development Studies, Chennai, who will be moderating today's session. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our Chief Patron, Honorable Dr. Justice Meena Vigombar, former Chief Justice of Rajasthan High Court, Professor Divakar Goli, President, Raffles University, Neemrana, Deepika Dave, President of Raise Global Foundation, and all the respected participants, viewers, listeners, both on Zoom platform and also our Facebook platform, that is Viswanathan Center for Asian Blossoming Facebook page. Before the talk of our speaker, let me give a kind of brief introduction to respected speaker. First, I would like to give a kind of brief introduction to Dr. John Clammer. John Clammer is very well known for us, at least. And in our Swadhyay subject, he often talk very deep concern, with very deep concern of humanities. Dr. John Clammer is a professor of sociology in Jindal Global Liberal Arts and Humanities and in Jindal Global Law School at OP Jindal Global University, India. He was previously professor of development sociology at United Nations University, Tokyo, and prior to that, professor of comparative sociology at Sophia University, Tokyo. He is the author of 17 books, including Belgrave, Macmillan volume, Culture of Transition and Sustainability. His research interest encompasses the sociology of art, urban sociology, sociology of religion, and sociological theory of East and West. Thank you so much, sir, for accepting our invitation. We have next speaker, Professor Dr. Anitra Thorhaug is an American marine biologist, plant ecophysiologist, and a chemical oceanographer whose extensive work on the rehabilitation of coastal ecosystems has had a substantial influence on national and international policies on conservation around the world. Professor Anitra has elucidated toxic levels of pollutants through field and laboratory experimentation and helped nations around the world to set a scientific standards to eliminate a series of pollutants. She is the first woman to receive PhD in oceanography. Her academic career includes faculty position in leading universities in United States of America. Her consultancy career includes United Nations agencies like UNEP, FAO, IOC, UNDP, many national and governments and industries where she has been influential in alleviating pollution as well as protecting and restoring near shore resources. Professor Anitra serves a chair of physiology of the American Botanical Society, program chair and past president of United States Association of the Club of Rome. For her many environmental, scientific and policy studies, she has won a series of awards, including 4 awards from the United Nations and an honorary doctorate. We welcome you, ma'am. Thank you so much for our accepting our invitation. Let me give a brief introduction to our SOHSS Chakra. SOHSS Chakra, co-learning circle of self and mutual studies. It is an initiative of studying and learning together self, culture, societies, and the world. Friends associated with this are eager to work and mediate with new horizons of thinking and new movements of social and cultural change at work in our contemporary world. We are study seekers such as Sri Aurobindo, Mahatma Gandhi, Chitranjan Das, a creative seeker and creative thinker from Odisha, and many others from around the world. We also present our own writings and reflects upon our creativity together. We also invite seekers from different fields of life to share with us their lives, visions, sadhana, and struggles for creating a world of beauty, dignity, and dialogues. We meet every Sunday or sometimes on Wednesday. Now we are nurturing this dialogue in collaboration with the School of Humanities and Social Science of Raffles University. Today is a very special topic, that is the challenge of climate change and COP26. We live in a world which shows how climate change is making life harder for us in varied ways that threatens our health, safety, and homes. The COP26 United Nations Climate Change meeting was held, as you know, in Glasgow. Is an important step in the world's attempt to deal with the climate emergency arising from increasing greenhouse gas emission. I can recall Nobel laureate Paul Kutchen, who fought climate change and died in this year in the month of February. He wrote the threat of climate change and said that a daunting task lies ahead for scientists and engineers to provide solution. We hope we will get some insightful ideas in today's talk in order to solve the problem of deep human concern. With this brief introduction, now I would like to invite Professor Anant Kumar Giri sir to kindly moderate the session.
Thank you so much, Randhir. A warm welcome to Professor John Clammer and Professor Anitra Thorhaug. And as we are with our journey of conversation and mutual learning, with a thrust towards transformation at this point, world leaders are meeting in Glasgow, and that is so significant. I also wish to draw your kind attention to another aspect of the day today. That is, on this day in 1984, just 10 years before the initial agreement that brought 196 countries together, starting of the COP, in 1984 on October 31st, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was gone down. And Prime Minister Indira Gandhi played a very important role in Stockholm Conference on Environment and Development. And Prime Minister Gandhi harped on this point, Indira Gandhi harped on this point, the significance of economic justice, social justice, how environmental concern has to be tied with the concern of life and livelihood. And we also need to remember that one of the initial grassroots action that really initiated a global turning around issue of climate and ecology is the grassroots movement from the Himalayas called the Chipko movement, which means hug the tree movement. So as world leaders are meeting today, and as they and as representatives of us, humanity, they are confronting the challenge of climate change. And here we remember the deep work of Arnold Toynbee. Toynbee taught at Oxford, and possibly Professor Clammer might have heard him. And he talks about the whole dynamics of challenge and response. Now, the climate change is a challenge, and the responses that we need to offer, they are multidimensional. Today's meeting is mainly the meetings of heads of states, but it needs to be accompanied by multiple kinds of engagement: transnational civil society mobilization, mobilization of self, community, because like the Chipko movement, even in this, in face to face with climate collapse, many communities, many individuals are mobilizing their processes of regeneration. What Professor Anitra is helping us in our talk on ecosystem regeneration is being accompanied by regeneration in communities. For example, many Dalit communities, Adivasis communities in India, their work is being recorded by groups like Kalpabruksha and the network of groups of alternative tapestry of human future, friends like Ashish Kothari. They are challenging us to understand the creativity of communities and the solutions, the ways that they are fashioning. So therefore, one aspect of the challenge is to realize the whole dynamics of globe will formation. And Professor Clammer also has been with the United Nations. So he can really help us, this understanding the UN approaches and the many dimensions to it, challenges and ups and downs. But as we saw in the Paris Agreement also, much more focus is on carbon trade and exchange, so on and so forth, but not so much attention to the whole question of socio-economic justice. It is in this context that we need to bring both, the carbon issues as part of the wider issues of economy, culture, and modes of life. And here, as Dipesh Chakrabarty, in his recent book, The Climate of History in Our Planetary Age, he invites us to realize that as Homo sapiens, we are also Homo prudens. And at the moment, we need to develop how we can be creatively more prudential. And it is in this context, we remember Rachel Carson, The Silent Spring. And we also remember this heart-touching song of Juan Baez, Where Have All the Flowers Gone? And again, this is a challenge to ask this question, where have all the flowers gone? As Professor Anitra tells us in her abstract, now the 50% of the forest is destroyed. Even the marine mangroves are destroyed. What is the significance of mangroves? Mangroves really, they provide an ecosystem and kind of free us from the tides and help us. But the tide that is confronting us, it is not only the tide of weather and change, but there is also another fundamental tide, and that is related, and Professor Clammer has written about it, our contemporary culture of consumption and capitalism. So here I present this line of thought from a very deep thinker of our time, Professor Manoj Das, who had just left his mortal body, and he writes the following. What is wrong with this tide? This collective resignation to the spell of hedonism is not its immoral and unethical character, for one can argue that the concepts of morality and ethics change from time to time. The situation is bad because it is against the spirit of evolution, because it is a negative reaction to the call for an adventure in consciousness. Hedonism not only fails to deliver the promised pleasure, it drains one of one's zest for life and leads to either self-destruction or anarchy. So today, as we are talking about COP26, not only the carbon, but also the tide of consumerism and hedonism, and then it is really taking us away from our ability to prepare ourselves for the evolutionary jump. And this evolutionary challenge, the challenge of evolutionary transformation of contemporary self, society, culture, economy, that is also a profound challenge. Therefore, the invitation is first for a civilizational transition, and that civilizational transition is facilitated by trans-civilizational dialogue. And let this dialogue happen not only among civilizations, but also among species. Let us also have dialogue with plants. As Professor Anitra can help us, we can listen to the plants, the marine ecosystems, And that transition is linking to the earlier story about Prime Minister Gandhi being gone down today. So therefore, there is this violence. I think the contemporary climate crisis collapse is an instance of the violence, and the violence against nature, violence against the human degradation that Professor Anitra points to. That degradation has to be transferred by cultivating cultures of non-violence. And I think, therefore, it is in this context we would have to think about creative ways of mobilization. As we begin with this song, and let us think about climate festivals, not only of world leaders, let there be grassroots climate prayer movement as the World Social Forum, slowly beginning with a limited circle, and it slowly became a world grassroots movement. Similarly, we need to think about a grassroots mobilization of climate concern. And that would make us a butterfly, because today we continue this whole caterpillar annihilation and violent tendency. And with and beyond the butterfly violence, how do we create butterflies? I would just conclude my submission with a brief poem. Can I share the screen, please? And this one, maybe it is not too clear. It is called Flower, Forest, Inner and Outer. Flower in the forest, flower in the eyes, flower in our lips, flower in our hearts, the beauty of forest. Our souls also make a beautiful forest. Our thoughts and relation, man, ban and upaban, mind, forest and gardens, tapasya with the forest, tapasya with the inner forest, tapasya with the outer forest, a new ecology of body and mind, beauty and spirit. With this submission, it is my joy to invite my dear and respected friend, Professor John Clammer.
Hey, good evening, everyone, once again. This event is becoming almost my Sunday night regular appearance, I think. I hope you're not getting bored. But looking at my face, those of you who've seen me many weeks, and I believe you might see me next Sunday too, in another context. But thank you for the, once again, the invitation. This extremely relevant, timely topic, and I know it's been put together rather quickly, but as I think we're all aware, today is the day in which the COP26 conference is beginning in Glasgow, as Ananta pointed out, this very day. Given the time difference, I imagine it's starting sometime about now. And indeed, many significant heads of state. I think Mr. Joe Biden is there, for example. I'm not sure if the Chinese head of state has gone. A day or two ago, he wasn't sure, nor Australian Prime Minister. Several people who really should be present perhaps are not there, but nevertheless, this is clearly one of these rare and major gatherings of the people we like to call our leaders. Although, as Greta Thunberg has often pointed out in the last year or so, whether that's a title they really have earned is not really clear when it comes to issues of climate change. Talk about it. But whether there is serious leadership and serious thinking about these issues, they're still problematic. We will see, and I think the whole world will be watching very closely what happens in Glasgow in the next 10 days. We should remember this is COP26, meaning that there have been 25 previous conferences of parties discussing essentially the same issue. And in fact, I'm, as many of you know, at the moment, actually physically in Kyoto, Japan, where of course one of the major climate conferences was held. And even at that time, one could see the political issues that were deeply involved in addressing the question, which is really of huge existential importance to everybody. And indeed, if any of you know the history of the original Kyoto Agreement, was that a number of the key countries that were amongst the major polluters did not sign, they did not ratify the Kyoto Agreement. They've remained outside it, despite their own responsibility. And of course, the usual argument for that is the one about, well, it's going to stymie, economic growth. It often comes back to that issue. And perhaps few politicians have been quite brave enough to actually put themselves on the line, their electoral future, I guess. And we're thinking about this here in Japan. It's 8 p.m. here, and I think the polling stations just closed. Today is also the day of the general election here in Japan. So within a few hours, we're going to know probably the constitution of the new government, if it's really very any different from the old government. I think the prime minister was planning, the new prime minister actually was planning to come to Glasgow, but I think probably because of the election, that was not possible. I hope the environment minister at least is there. So 25 previous attempts to wrestle with the question of addressing what we now know to be scientifically proven to be the case, that we are experiencing climate change, and that the primary basis of that rise of temperatures, for example, particularly, is human activity, primarily human economic activity. In the little song that Randhir played for us at the beginning, of course, when we realize, we see the people who are performing the song, of course, were children. These are the people who will indeed inherit what is happening in the present. And I think to see those children is a very live reminder of this is not just something that's going to happen to, we adults perhaps in the next 4 or 5 years, but it's going to be the future which we bequeath very much to the next generation. And indeed, if extreme forms of climate change do occur, it won't be only to the next generation, it will be to many generations into the future, locked in fact, to the practices that our current political industrial system has generated. That's not going to go away. And in fact, as I'm sure you're also very much aware, there are many people who say, in fact, it's not too late, but in fact, we've already triggered changes in climate, which will be locked in whether or not carbon emissions are reduced to a sufficient level to restrict the temperature rise to maybe the agreed or desired 1.5 degrees Celsius. Even if that goal is reached, there will still be major changes of the kind we're already seeing, around the world at the moment: wildfires, extreme storms, extreme rainfall in unusual places, erratic weather. Even here in Japan, after an October, which was running at around summer temperatures until about 2 weeks ago, exactly 2 weeks ago, Sunday, 2 weeks ago, the temperature then dropped to winter temperatures in one day. And actually, unfortunately, they've just recovered to something not quite like summer temperatures, but at least mild temperatures, I think, yesterday. So, unexpected fluctuations in climate and all of the other climate disasters, as we're aware, the massive and unexpected floods in Germany, in particular in Europe, a month ago, and so forth. As I'm sure you're also very aware, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued its updated report approximately 2 months ago, in plenty of time for the delegates to the COP26 to read it. And it's a very interesting report. If you haven't, it's available, and its summary is, of course, available online freely to everybody. It's such a vital human document, in fact. And what if you've read it, or at least read the summary of it, you will see immediately are two things, I think. One is that the highly distinguished scientific panel, many authors that are collectively responsible for that report, I think have shown without any doubt the scientific basis of the arguments that climate change is happening and that it is anthropomorphic in nature. It's generated by human activity, not primarily by the shifts which occur in, there are climatic shifts which have occurred, of course, throughout geological history. As we know, ice ages, periods of mild weather in between ice ages and so on. But we're not dealing primarily with that kind of issue now. We're dealing with human-induced. And I think they've shown incontrovertibly. So people who've argued that climate change is a myth, if they really look at that report, it would be very, very hard to argue with the science that is presented there. The second thing I think is very important about the recent new version of the report is its extreme urgency. I mean, I think it's been true in the past that many of the authors, contributing authors to that kind of report, and other climate scientists as well, not only the members of the Intergovernmental Panel, been a little wary about going beyond the bounds of their scientific expertise in the narrow sense and really drawing attention to the consequences of what they're saying. That's perhaps moving out of science in the strict sense into questions of politics and controversy. What I think is also important about that report is that finally it's done that. It's moved simply from the presenting to us with, if you like, the facts, to pointing out that those facts are critical to the human future, in fact, and without attention to the facts that are presented in the report. Well, if you take a very pessimistic view of this, either we don't have a future or that future is going to be very different from the current one in terms of changes of course, climate pattern, the effects this is going to have on agriculture, the effect this is going to have on the potential generation of huge numbers of climate refugees, and all of the issues that have been charted by many people, and I'm sure most of us are aware of this. As someone who formerly worked for the United Nations, at the time when the COVID crisis started about 2 years ago, many people were pointing out the idea that the UN seemed to be increasingly ineffective. It was not really able to mobilize countries in an effective, multinational, multilateral kind of response to the emerging pandemic. Even the World Health Organization wasn't even prepared to call it a pandemic until really they were pressured into realizing this was not just an outbreak of a small kind, possibly even like SARS, which had preceded it, a related viral illness, of course. It was something, in fact, far, far worse than that, as we've now experienced. I think, however, when we come back to the question of climate change, we found one of the grounds in which countries really are able to talk to one another, because all of them are indeed, as the name of the COP conference suggests, are indeed parties to this process. No one is exempt because no one is off planet. And unless you're a big fan of science fiction and imagine us flying off to other planets, assuming we can find one so agreeable as the Earth, which we already have, we're stuck on this planet, basically. Okay. So where do we pursue our thinking? Now, Ananta's already raised some of those questions. So let me perhaps just underline a few of them, which I think are extremely important, and then maybe stress one or two others, which I think are keys to this question. At the COP26 movement, of course, we will be seeing primarily, again, our political leaders and industrial lobbies. It's worth mentioning this, by the way, that very large numbers of industrial corporations send their representatives to lobby at the COP meetings in order, in many cases, of course, to attempt to water down agreements which might be made, which they see as damaging to their own economic status. And of course, those always include the fossil fuel companies, the fossil fuel industry is very much implicated in this kind of lobbying against strong position being taken, despite the science, right? And despite the fact that we, I think, now fully aware of very aware of what the social economic consequences of climate change are likely to be. So it's also true that many NGOs, many activists, other people will be there in Glasgow. I mean, are there, I'm sure, at the moment in Glasgow, making a lot of noise around the edges of the conference, whether they're actually party to the main discussions or not. Keeping the noise level very high to make sure that the actual delegates do hear the voices of social movements, not just examples like the Chipko movement that Ananta mentioned, but many, many others, of course, are there, trying to ensure that the voices of people are heard. And let's hope that they are heard. In that context, of course, there are at least 3 or 4 key issues, I think, which again, I think we're aware of, but again, worth stressing because they're easy to state, but sometimes difficult to operationalize. You know, I think we are aware that underlying a lot of the issues of climate change we see around us are personal consumption habits. You know, the habits of driving, the habits of flying, the habits of turning up our air conditioners too high in the summer and turning up our heating too high in the winter, not taking simple steps such as ensuring that our homes, for example, are insulated in ways that keep heat in when the weather is cold, you know, keep cold weather out, which can be done fairly inexpensively, but yet empirical studies, which have been shown in the States, for example, in California, showed that many householders, despite the pressure of the California state government to encourage people to reduce energy consumption, did not make very simple steps to make that come true, to make that, including, again, simply insulating their homes, which once done is a permanent feature, which inevitably reduces energy costs because you don't need so much energy. You're keeping the place warm or cool, whichever it may be, with far less energy input than you do in a kind of conventional dwelling, because it's not insulated. It's very easy to do, yet people don't do this. And indeed, there have been at least one empirical study that I've read recently, which 2 anthropologists were asked to, in fact, investigate this and present these kind of findings to both the energy companies themselves and the California state government in order to try to overcome these kind of strange and apparently irrational blockages. You know, if you know you can cut your energy costs by several $1,000s a year, making very simple steps such as insulating your home, why don't you do it? And the answers, of course, turn out to be quite complicated, including that in many cases, people actually don't know how much they spend on energy. You know, they realize they're paying quite a lot for their power to the utilities company that are providing their energy, but actually to have very little knowledge of how much they're really paying, how it breaks down, whether it varies a lot over the course of the year, and simple economic calculations like that, which one would expect to be pretty obvious to people. They are not. So it is true, therefore, of course, that our personal behavior has cumulatively a lot of effects. And I say cumulatively because I've read people, and you may have done too, who say, oh, look, okay, I mean, if you recycle your newspapers and your cans and your bottles, right? You try to minimize your waste or compost any kitchen waste that you generate in the course of normal cooking and things like this. But as an individual, you make effectively no difference, of course, to the state of the world. That's only true if you look at people simply as individuals, but not as collectivities, of course. And if people are acting collectively, then of course those individual changes in behavior add up. But we can point, therefore, of course, as many people have done, it's hardly unique to myself, the need to cultural shifts away from consumption towards, for example, sharing, recycling, reuse, and all of those things that that we're very aware of are possible, but yet are not in fact practiced by an awful lot of people yet. So it's easy to say that, but of course it's often very difficult to actually do that. I might be able to reduce my consumption by being more careful about and not buying products in wrapping that cannot itself be recycled and doing things like this. But when it comes to bigger changes, a lot of us are quite reluctant to do this. Now, as you're aware, there's been a huge pressure to move for car manufacturers to move towards the production of electric cars. And many car companies have said that they will, in fact, even as early as 2030, only 9 years from now, have completely stopped producing petrol and diesel-driven cars. Will move entirely to electric cars. But as critics of that position have pointed out, and that's good. I mean, that's definitely going to reduce the air pollution. I mean, it'll be lovely to drive around Delhi if all the cars in Delhi are are electric, because the car and amongst other things, level of pollution generated in Delhi is extreme. Okay, especially at this time of year in the winter, from November till about sometime in February or March, the air quality is extremely bad. Cars are not the only culprit there, but they're one of them. Traffic is one of those things. But as people have pointed out, so we moved to electric cars, but we're still driving cars. Those cars themselves utilize huge amounts of resources in terms of metal, rubber, plastics, et cetera, the batteries at the moment, which are used to power electric cars, are still not that efficient, and themselves are extremely energy intensive in their production process. And of course, if there are just as many electric cars on the road as there are petrol driven or diesel driven cars at the moment, we're still going to have to live not with the pollution necessarily, but with the same kind of traffic jams. In other words, the solution there is not moving to electric cars. The solution is persuading people and to switch as far as possible to the use of public transport, shared transport, or at least car sharing. And for governments, of course, responsibility of governments to provide the kind of affordable, accessible, clean, safe public transport, which makes it desirable to travel on it rather than being stuck in a traffic jam in your private car. And of course, many governments have not yet done that. Japan is by no means a paradise, but one of the things I do very much admire about this country is the remarkable quality of its public transport. Metro systems in the large cities, buses, suburban and intercity trains. So in many cases, it's simply not worth people driving. It's more expensive in terms of your gas use. You have to park, you have to sit in jams, you contribute to pollution and this kind of stuff. You take the train. Trains are safe, efficient, rarely stop or rarely break down or are late. Very occasionally that happens, but mostly not. So under those conditions, of course, most people here are very willing to use public transport. It's also very safe. It's not a kind of crime scene that you find in some cities where taking public transport can in fact be quite risky process. If it's safe, efficient, cheap, and very small amendments are made, which they are in some Indian cities. But of course, this is where culture comes into the question as well. There are Indian cities in which there are bus lanes. That's to say, the left-hand lane is supposed to be reserved for public transport, so that buses can move quickly. They are not, even if there is a jam in the rest of the road, buses are not affected by this. In fact, unfortunately, as we well know, everybody drives in the bus lane. I mean, I think the traffic police occasionally, make a little pocket money out of this fact because they know they're going to be able to fine people for doing this. But it doesn't work simply because people do not accept the principle that the bus lanes are really for buses. Or in some countries where I've seen the same process, they are also for taxis or for a private car carrying at least 4 people. So if you have 4 people in your car, if you're car sharing, you can use the bus lane because, of course, you are in fact moving 4 times as many people as would be moved if they were each driving their private car. So we have that question of cultural shifts. The big tricky issue, of course, is how to induce those kind of cultural shifts. And I wonder about this sometimes. I mean, we don't have time to go into tonight what sort of carrot and stick processes can be used here, or whether we're a strange species, notably that we don't change until we really face a crisis. When the crisis forces us to change, then we do. But that's unfortunate, of course, because this kind of crisis we can see coming. It's not a question of lack of knowledge. I won't elaborate on these points too far, but I think amongst the other two very important points that I would raise, and one again was raised briefly by Ananta. Well, one is the question of our relationship to the natural environment, one he did not mention. That is to say, to rethink the way we understand ourselves as being part of nature, not apart from it. And so what happens to the rest of nature around us, of course, affects us. It will ultimately affect us. And this can be not only with the obvious things, again, like pollution, loss of animal species and this kind of things, but things we may not understand at all because we're not aware of the intricacies in many cases of ecological systems and how they are interlocking systems. The loss of one species, for example, is not necessarily just the loss of one species. That species itself has complex relations with other species in its environment. And therefore the species of one lost species may in fact trigger widespread effects running throughout an extensive ecosystem. But the other issue, and I'm very glad Ananta raised this, was that, of course, what our leaders are going to be talking about in Glasgow in the next few days is primarily carbon, and the question of either bringing carbon emission levels down, or all these suggested technologies which are still in a very, very unproven state to sequester carbon. And as I know Professor Thorhaug will probably talk about in a moment, of course, forests themselves are one of the major sources of sequestration of carbon. But carbon is not, and I'm glad Ananta pointed this out, the only issue. By no means the only issue. It's essential, of course, that this is controlled. But along with that go many questions, for example, of social justice and human rights issues. And I think these are equally critical. It would be possible, for example, to probably imagine shifts in, assuming they might even happen, in economic processes that did indeed lead to reductions, serious reductions in the level of carbon being released, or in the possibility of sequestering that carbon, which have negative effects on large parts of the population, whether because of some kind of displacement, because of loss of jobs, or any number of possibilities. So the fact is, of course, therefore, any positive climate policy has to be one that's not only concerned with the ecological dimensions of its impact, but also, of course, with its social implications. And I think that needs saying over and over again. The social justice elements of climate change policy are as important, I think, in many ways, as the issues of carbon. And focusing only on carbon, of course, does tend to occlude attention to those other issues. But let me just move on quickly to a couple of other questions. Now, I don't know if you'd agree. I've often argued that the key problem, and we need to argue it, probably we'd all agree with this, that the key problem underlying the issue of climate change is our economy. I say it's very easy to blame the consumer, you're consuming too much. But then let's face it, it's our economy that is pushing that kind of consumption, is manufacturing. And I was reading something in the newspaper today about the fact that the supply chain problems, particularly in relation to China and other sources of components, have slowed down car production in countries like Japan. The car manufacturers are grumbling that they cannot, in fact, maintain the output of vehicles at their expected level because of an inability for them to get the kind of essential components that they need. And of course, from their point of view, this is awful. It's a terrible tragedy. We're not making, therefore selling, obviously, as many cars. I personally think that's actually not such a bad thing at all. If the number of cars being produced is reduced, then obviously that means less cars driving around on the roads. And of course, we are, as we know, encouraged to do this as a status symbol because of the lack of good, safe public transport, whatever reasons. So in fact, we have to look, therefore, very, very critically at the nature of our economic system. And again, that's a big issue. And what I suspect will happen, and indeed, when I was working with the UN, we often used to have debates about this question, about the green economy or greening the economy. And I'm sure in Glasgow over the next few days, we're going to hear lots of talk about things like green consumption or green capitalism. The idea that we can basically maintain our present level of consumption and so on, if we move to greener products, whatever exactly they might be. I think we have to be very, very careful, very, very critical of that kind of idea because of two things. Number one, if we in fact consume as much and use as much energy as we were using in the past, but we're consuming green products, essentially nothing's changed. Just as much waste will be generated, probably just as much energy goes into the production of these kind of products, even if the product themselves, say, is recyclable or can biodegrade, or whatever we understand by the second notion is what in fact we mean by green. Now, I've even seen oil companies arguing that their products are green, that they're working on decarbonizing, that more efficient forms of petroleum and so on, which will not generate as much pollution as previous models did. And indeed, there have been positive changes. About a decade or a little more than a decade ago, one of the major problems with petroleum products is they contained lead. And of course, that lead was being emitted into the environment. And as we're probably aware, lead is a very and not a healthy thing to be breathing, entering your bloodstream and so on. And so now, of course, most petrols, I think probably all petrols in most countries, are unleaded. They do not contain lead. So there have been progress in that way, but that progress maybe is simply incremental and is not really structural in any way. Therefore, I think the difficult thing is, and it is a major challenge, is to look seriously at the question of economic alternatives. Not just this idea that, if current energy companies move towards things like solar and wind power, if this won't lead to loss of jobs, this will in fact create new jobs in this new kind of green economy. But in fact, to be very critical about what we mean by this kind of idea of green consumption. Does it really have any meaning beyond making us feel probably a little better about the idea that we're using products which can be recycled in some way or in other ways are more benign in their relationship to the environment. So two concluding thoughts. One is that structural issues of the nature of the planetary problems we face at the moment need structural solutions. And I think the challenge for the participants in the COP26 meeting will be whether they can really grasp that. The cosmetic solutions really no longer work. I think, as we've seen over the last 30 years or so, the previous COP25, even when pledges are made, they are not necessarily fulfilled. We saw this with the Paris climate agreement, for example, in which some countries, for example, China, as I think the world's biggest single polluter, is expecting carbon emissions to rise substantially between now and about 2030, after which they think they will be able to reduce them. This is now called into question because China is facing an energy crunch. They don't want their economy to slow down. So they are reopening coal-powered fire stations and forcing coal mines that were mothballed to reopen to produce the coal necessary for this kind of production. This is not the kind of solution. It's not so popular these days, perhaps, to talk about revolutions. In fact, we haven't had a good revolution for a while anywhere in the world, right, I think. But perhaps we're due for one. And maybe this is the revolution that we really should be quite willing to become agents of, right? Truly to become revolutionaries, because it's the whole future of the planet which is dependent on this, of course. And without revolutionary changes, there are not likely to be the kind of substantial modifications to behavior and economy in particular, which allow a genuine solution to emerge. And without that, we have a very uncomfortable future for our planet, for the children we saw in the song at the beginning. And that is a matter of fact. If we face that, then we have to face the necessity of radical solutions. Thank you very much once again, for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Arigato gozaimasu for bringing so many deep interconnected processes and concerns together, and especially the concluding imperative of all of us being creative agent. And that is the part of a revolutionary process. Thank you. Now, with joy, we look forward to being enriched by thoughts and presence of Professor Anitra Thorhaug. She brings to us her very deep knowledge, insight, experience, And she was telling us in her Club of Rome meeting how she goes underwater and and stays in the marine ecosystem and cohabiting with different kind of beings there. So we are very grateful to you, Professor Anitra, for being with us, and we look forward to your thoughts and illuminations, please.
I'm very delighted to be here. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yes, good. And I'm particularly delighted to be at the very southern tip of India as India's continent plunges into the Indian Ocean, because Chennai was one of my favorite places on my last trip. I made a special effort to get to Chennai, and I found the people brimming with energy, the small farmers and those taking their things to the marketplace, and the entrepreneurs. I founded a place alive with vibrant energy. And that's so wonderful because there's so many countries in the world, such as Bulgaria, Romania, parts of China that I've been to, that are trodden down. They feel burdened by the responsibilities of the world. But in Chennai, everybody is alive. If you could be so kind to share the screen so that I could, okay, share screen. Good, 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 good. There we go. And now I can start my slideshow. So I'm going to tell you about two things today. And the first one is my rebellion. So I'm a revolutionary. And we're going from how you would value the present financial system and the GDP and all these material goods that we all surround ourselves with, to a different value system. We pivot, and the value system we seek is the well-being of the earth, its ecosystems, and its peoples. And we've been studying this in a Club of Rome group that I lead with David Corton and 17 other people. And we think about the word regeneration. And regeneration is a revolution to many people. So that's what I'd like to tell you about, in the middle of which I will sneak in my own work on regeneration of hotspots in the tropics, of carbon sequestration. But keep in mind that all of this regeneration is meant to lower the temperature and is a definite solution to many of the things they talk about in COP26. But the people there haven't understood the big picture at all, the revolutionary regeneration picture. So we will begin on this whirlwind tour of regeneration of ecosystems. And this, yes, this is me. And I'm hugging the seagrasses, as you can see. I hug coral reefs, I hug mangrove trees. You said you had hugged people, but I welcome you to the next step of our exploration. So follow me, and by your sapphire shore, we are going to walk through an emerald door into the kingdom neath the sea. So just follow me, and we all may go on an adventure. First of all, regenerating our habitats in the world, our key ecological habitats, is a concept far beyond limits to growth, which was the most important volume that the Club of Rome, which Ananta and I both are full members in, and by Dana Meadows, a dear friend of mine, Dennis Meadows, Jorgen Randers. That is the old-fashioned degenerative, when the world and finance and industry just simply thought of degenerating systems. continually degenerating systems. And there was a large meeting in Canada and other places led by Gro Harlem Brundtland, the Prime Minister of Norway, called Our Common Future, where they came to something called sustainability, which was a compromise between the depletion people, like the gas and oil, the mining people, and the environmental people. But this is all 35, 40 years old, and we've gone into a restorative kind of mode, which in most countries, including India and the United States, where I come from, and most of Western Europe, in no way has brought back the ecosystems, which I will show you in a moment. So I'm calling for a new system called regenerative, and that's a design for living systems where we have to pay attention to bringing back the quantity and quality that we need to make our planet, the only planet we have, the third pod from the sun, livable into the future. And how would we change the paradigm from an entire humanity population thinking about their goals being growth, GDP, and money, to regenerative goals of community growth, of ecosystems, well-being for nations, communities, and individuals. And I want to say one of the first lectures we had in this series was about your neighbor, Bhutan, who has already made this pivot and is very happy with the pivot, that well-being is far more important to them than GDP. So we would regenerate forests globally. We would regenerate tundra, estuaries, fisheries, rivers, and lakes. And I'm going to help you understand the costs and the activities and what we would do. I've spent about a 50-year period since I first restored for nuclear power plants in Florida all that they had left asunder. The destruction of the global terrestrial ecosystems leaves us with only 15% of the original forests of the world. And here is a picture of them. And the tropical forests are probably the most important. They're the most widespread. And the key issues are in Brazil and Central Africa, in the Cameroons and nearby countries. But there is some large amount in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia and up northern eastern India. As of 2021, this is an FAO report, so it's looked at tens of thousands of pieces of data. We have a half of a hectare, or about an acre a person, including forests and agricultural spaces. Where are they? Where are these spaces? First of all, Russia, because it has this huge boreal area, has the most, 815 million hectares. Brazil having the second, about 500 million, but it's Brazil and its surrounding countries like Peru and parts of Venezuela. Canada and the United States have about 660 million hectares between them, and China has a fifth of what Russia has. Then the rest of the world, all 200 other countries, have the remaining 46%. So you see that if this turns around in these four countries, a great deal can occur. This is a rather complicated graph, but of the 93% of the 15% still alive of forests, 7% are in plantations, and only 1% are in regenerated forests. So this is what we want to change. And this is simply a graph of how much shrinkage there's been in the last 30 years in the normal forests themselves and in the planted and the regenerated forests, in the plantations. Now, if we go under the water, we have also a very dire situation. So there's no place we can escape to. Most of the productivity of the marine life, and I am a marine scientist, takes place close to shore. The middle of the ocean is more or less a desert. It has plankton at the very, very upper layer, yes, but the rest of it is more or less a desert. And you see in Southeast Asia and India for the seagrass distribution, you have most of the seagrasses of the world, but you have a goodly amount in the Caribbean Sea and in Oceania. These are the mangroves of the world, and the green is the fringes of the mangrove. So you see the Western Hemisphere has a lot, so does Southeast Asia, India and Sri Lanka together, South India and Sri Lanka together, and a little in northern India, Pakistan. These are the coral reefs of the world in this map, and much of them are in Oceania, but many of them are in Southeast Asia and some in the Caribbean Sea. What are the values of these ecosystems to humanity? This is very important. And one of the most important things I say to you today, if you only remember one thing, is that many of our myths of the evolution between God and humankind don't take into consideration what evolution teaches us, that the plants were here far before any animals whatsoever inhabited the earth. The rocks came up out of the sea by volcanic eruptions, and they started being evolved with plants which produced oxygen, and that created our atmosphere. And that was followed by evolution of animals. So the plants produce oxygen. The plants scrub the carbon dioxide that has been put in excess by the fossil fuels, by the burning of fossil fuels, by cement and other things to create the climate warming. And plants retain water in soils. So you find desert places like Libya, Morocco, which have lost their prairies and their grasslands and their forests, that they don't have water in their groundwater anymore. And it's, of course, forests and plant systems are a direct food source as well as an indirect food source. They have the biodiversity of life. They have soil and shoreline stabilization. So when heavy floods, such as experienced in Bangladesh and the northeast section of India, occur from the Himalaya mountains, all that water comes down. It isn't just washed out to the sea, it's stabilized by whatever vegetation is. And of course, it's an excellent animal habitat. And it's important to know that 1/3 of the non-frozen terrestrial space is presently used for livestock. And thank God, southern India is far beyond the world in understanding that meat eating is not to be highly encouraged because it's taking away so much space for forests. This is a mangrove restoration. India could go heavily into mangrove restoration, and my scheme for regeneration has local communities and local employment receiving most of the funding and doing much of the work. So this is in Oman, and this is the already restored on the upper right, and this is the restoring mangrove. And it really is simple, and children and older people can do this, as well as students and a wide range of non-skilled people. So it's a wonderful employment opportunity. These are coral regeneration techniques seen from Florida. And there are different ways of growing different corals, but you will see that there are many, many techniques ongoing and being utilized. All of these regenerative techniques have been looked at for 100 to 150 years, and there are big solutions to all of them. In the case of corals, it's about 50 years. In the case of seagrass, about 50 years. But we still have the techniques ready to go. It's the political will and the funding that is not ready to go. And here we restore seagrass, starting at the lower right-hand corner. We put in plugs and sprigs of seagrass anchored down into the sediment. And this is from the Indian Ocean, amphibolous. And it grows after half a year bigger and then bigger and finally becomes a complete bed. And you should know that all the animals that recolonize free of charge, they just, once they see the habitat, they rush back in and they recolonize the habitat. And this is done by scuba, of course, and it's done underwater, because that which is done in the very shallow water washes away from typhoons, monsoons, tsunamis, and other kinds of natural disruption. So what are we losing per year from man's ongoing onslaught onto the marine environment? About 6% of our mangroves, and it should be per year, not decade, about 7% of our seagrass, about 8% of our coral. You can see that within 10, 20 years, we're going to have nothing left. And in the fisheries, particularly the Pacific, the Indian, Atlantic Oceans, these factory ships are making extreme depletion of all the fish products. And the oyster reefs are being killed, as well as the endangered species. So what are the values and what do we have? We also are degrading our freshwater lakes and our riverine habitats. And there's a connection between the two. Much of the ocean is being polluted with plastics, garbage, sewage, wastes coming down the rivers into the near shore area. Land wastes are polluting the estuary, destroying the habitat there. And along the rivers, the riparian vegetation is allowing much soil erosion, and that's happening large scale in India. So the priorities to regenerate these is, first of all, to take hotspots of the greatest productivity of growth and the sequestration degraded areas, which I will speak of in a minute, which borders on COP26 very much, and take special sites. So we want to lessen the waste and the degradational activities of man, including soil erosion from the farms and including soil erosion along the rivers. And we want to prioritize the highest areas of growth, which are the tropical areas, southern India, not northern India, Southeast Asia, Central Africa, the Caribbean. And we want to restore transitional areas which are not being used wisely between the agricultural areas and the urban ecosystems. Nobody is suggesting that we use all the agricultural areas that are now sculpted out of what used to be forests and grasslands, marginal farmlands. And we want to take shorelines, lakes, deltas, and regenerate those. And from that, we will get oxygen, carbon dioxide, water retention, and other resources. But it's important to remember that we, the animals called human beings, are totally dependent on these plant ecosystems for many things: the air we breathe, the oxygen we breathe, the food we eat, the water we have to drink. And without them, we will not long be here on the face of the earth. And that we are a chain of living ecosystems, and that we do not have dominion to take away or degrade or ruin any of the ecosystems. We indeed have once in a many millennium opportunity to use our brains and our minds and regenerate. And we're at a particular tipping point because we have the techniques to regenerate, we have the funds to regenerate, and we should all be thinking regeneration and well-being of the ecosystem and the humans that live in it. So the hotspots are in the tropics, and the world's desert nations, some of them like Morocco and parts of India, are also in the tropics, and we should think about these as very important places to regenerate. And as we regenerate, we sequester the CO2 scrubbed out of the air, put into the air by fossil fuel burning, and we bury it for it to live for long periods of time there. I want to explain to you why it's important to regenerate under the water and what I have done to help understand where you would regenerate and how. First of all, when the excess from fossil fuels goes into the oceans, it goes into the oceans in these blue areas here, this being the Pacific Ocean, Australia, Asian continent, India here. This is the Indian Ocean. So both in the Atlantic and in the Pacific, the CO2 partitions itself from the air to the sea. And then it goes on a deep journey underneath the sea and it pops up in the equator. This red is popped up heat and CO2. And here it is popping up in the Atlantic, and here it is popping up in the Indian Ocean. And then in the Pacific, and this is an area, South Pacific, it comes across as the equatorial, and when it hits the landmass brought by Coriolis force toward the west, it goes into the Indian Ocean from the Pacific, because there's this I'm sorry that I'm having difficulty. There's a hydrostatic head between the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean of a half a meter. So it pours from the Pacific through Indonesia and all these islands, Philippines, Papua New Guinea, into the Indian Ocean. And it carries a lot of heat with it. And therefore, this area here, where the CO2 is pouring from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean, is a hotbed of where restoration can be done that's extremely meaningful, because it has the heat, it can go 12 months, and it has the CO2, which is what plants need to grow. And this is made even more complex by a series of volcanic archipelago islands called Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Philippines, which make very shallow surfaces and a lot of space. So you have a lot of seagrass, a lot of mangroves, and a lot of corals here in this Southeast Asia region. I have done the amount of carbon sequestered per country in Southeast Asia, and I find that the island archipelagos where the CO2 is pouring from the Pacific to the Atlantic are far higher in sequestered carbon down into the sediments, where the mangroves and the seagrass and the corals are burying the carbon, than it is along the Asian continent of China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, etc. So these oceanic areas are very much benefiting by this rich CO2. And the same in the Caribbean. The water comes from the mid-Atlantic here through Yucatan. This is called the Gulf of Mexico. It has two loops. One goes around and comes up the east coast of the United States as the Gulf Stream, and the other goes through Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, like a hurricane might, and then up. And you see, there's nothing in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, no surfaces where mangroves or seagrass can grow. So if it doesn't grow right at the edge, it doesn't grow at all. And so if we go backward, we have about a fifth of the amount of sequestration from the mangroves, which are red here, and the seagrass, which are greenish blue, and the marshes in the Gulf of Mexico, as we have over here in Southeast Asia. So you in India are in a very good place to grow mangroves, which sequesters carbon, which will change the temperature downward from this 1.5, 5 times more than the Brazilians or the African forests. So mangroves are an extremely valuable thing for you to be planting in southern India. And we want to revive freshwater lakes and riverine habitats. This is a map of the United States, and you see at the northeast corner, there's a series of lakes between Canada and the United States. And these had gone into great disrepair, with lamprey eels eating all the valuable fisheries, and with tons of slag from the steel mills and mining industries going throughout them. In fact, this lake called Lake Erie would burn on a regular basis. Before that, these had been very important units during the exploration of the Americas for the French, the English, the Spanish, and other colonial groups. And this is a cleanup done in Indonesia. The president of Indonesia is behind this. And the Citarum River, 300 kilometers, was just full of trash and waste and floating sewage. And they are cleaning this up completely. So it's important to clean up the important lakes and the important rivers. So the steps we need is a global population. Every person must understand their role in consuming oxygen, water, stopping the CO2 export into the air as they eat whatever plants and animals they're going to make, and whether they're doing anything to help sequester the CO2 by planting plants that are native to their areas, around their houses and dwellings, and in their farms. And the people must not think that they are the masters of the ecosystems. They have to come to the realization that they're one of many living species that are trying to be well in this small planet we have called Earth. So first we need government and regional plans, and those probably should go through the Food and Agriculture Organization, because they're used to taking important ideas and taking them regionally, and also taking them and making them important nation by nation and putting them to work. I'm not sure why all those arrows are coming in, but it's interesting. So then there are large-scale initiation of actions by stakeholders, political leaders, youth, unemployed people, and NGOs, school children. Everyone can do this. Everybody can plant trees in a forest. Many people can plant mangrove trees along the shoreline when the tide is out. And we have to have a continual outreach by the governments, the public, the stakeholders, groups like yourself, to tell about how important this is for the future of our well-being on the earth. And then evaluate how this is working toward climate change, how it's working toward biodiversity. And these are the statistics. There are now almost 60 million hectares generating oxygen. Now, how low are we going to let this go? Are we going to come down to 1 million hectares for 9 billion people on the earth? You know, what is our risk factor? Are we going to allow complete degeneration to continue at 7-8% per year? And the grasslands are about 41 million kilometers squared. The marshes are about 5 million. The mangroves are about 17 million. The coral reefs are 3% of the ocean floor. Seagrass are about 17 million. Seaweed. And this to restore, and here I have the amounts that it costs per hectare to restore all of those kinds of major key habitats, giving us oxygen, sequestering carbon dioxide, giving us food. So it's going to cost about $250 billion. But the US government just passed $1.5 trillion to do almost nothing. So this is not an unusual amount for all the Western Hemisphere countries to be contributing. And much of it will go to the developing countries, at least half, to do regeneration of many unemployed people and many people with low employment. So what can we do as individuals? We can eat lower on the food chain. And it gives me great pleasure to address you in southern India who already have a diet full of important vegetables. In the Southeast Asia, they eat 250 pounds of seaweed per person per year. So that's one thing you might think about incorporating into your diet. Eat less water-consuming projects and restore native plants and plant them. And evaluate your lifestyle and stop whatever you can do forest conversion for livestock. Brazil is a particular area of concern. So our positive messages is to improve the estuary's marine shoreline, but also to improve the forests. And this is my little group who's done much of the work in the Western Hemisphere. And I have another group working now in Southeast Asia. It would be very nice to have a group working in India. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. And I hope that I've shed some light on some of the important steps that mankind must go forward with in their revolution against the financial system, GDP, because you can't eat money. You can't breathe money.
Thank you so much with our heart for this very, very deeply enriching presentation, and where science, in fact, one aspect as Professor Clammer began, that the IPC report brings us science, but engagement with science also shows us pathways, what each one of us can do. And your work brings us that rigor of science, hotspots, where is resource, and what we could do. And I am reminded here of the work of Professor M.S. Swaminathan. You might have heard about him, met him. And the Swaminathan Research Foundation is located in Chennai. A few years ago, 2 years ago, Professor Clammer and myself, we were there to greet him on his 90th birthday. And one of the efforts is mangrove regeneration. And there also the use of local community and bringing education there. And Professor Swaminathan is saying that restoration of ecology must go hand in hand with not only community involvement, but education. So many deep insights indeed. And when we listen to you, we feel that with all our challenges, still we are not devoid of the capacity to think differently and act differently. And therefore contributing to what Professor Swaminathan calls ecology, and that is an ecology of form. Again, our very, very deep gratitude, and I hope these thoughts really, enter into a different kind of planetary action, because this is doable. As we hear, we feel that it is doable. So now we invite reflections, on these two very important presentations. And I invite friends also to share their concerns in the chat box. And let me invite, Gianluigi, please.
Thank you. I am audible. I hope so. Thank you very much. Thank you. It was very beautiful, very interesting. I would like perhaps to begin with a reflection, because I think that some problems connected to the climate change are due to certain specific theological interpretation, at least in Western Europe and then in North America. That is the interpretation which is normally called and named, qualified as the Baconian interpretation of the Old Testament, in which God gives free use of nature and of animals to the men, to the human beings. That is, human beings are the master of nature, and in particular of the animals, but of the whole nature. And they may dominate nature. This is a long problem, of course, for theology, and which has probably contributed to a difficult relation with the nature, and to an interpretation of nature which is not autonomous, which has no autonomous value for itself, but which is directed to the human beings, and which has its only value exclusively for which it can contribute to the benefit of the human beings. Now, perhaps is in the theological, philosophical environment, the interpretation is a little bit different, because it is being spoken more and more of not of a dominance conceded by God to the human beings, but rather of a stewardship given by God to the human beings. It is not the same relation as a dominance. Stewardship is that men have the responsibility over nature, and therefore they may not do what they want to do with the nature itself. It is a question of responsibility over nature and not a dominance over nature. But of course, this is only a recent interpretation of the Old Testament, and it is not the interpretation which has been dominating over the past centuries. This perhaps is the first problem, first question, that is the problems we have something in, no problem. The problem which we now have with the climate change have actually roots which are eradicated in the past centuries. It is not something which is coming out now or in the last 2 centuries. It's something which has profound roots in the way of thinking of Europe and of North America. This is the first point. The second point, perhaps, is the question of the political relations between countries. Because I think that the biggest problem, or at least one of the biggest problems, which is in front of the protection of the climate and of the fight against climate change is that the countries which have not reached yet the level, the economical level of the most developed countries want aim to a development of their own standards of living, of life standards, and they can feel that the problematic of the climate change is a new kind of colonialism of the most developed countries, which pretend to go to the not yet developed countries and say, well, you have to do this and this and this. That is, I think this is a political problem rather than something else. There is a contrast between the interest of the not yet so developed countries, which aim to rightly also, because to reach life standards which are more appropriate for their own citizens, and the interest of the most developed countries which say, no, we have to stop now the use of the nature as it was in past centuries. And of course, the countries which has not yet reached the development of the most developed countries can say, no, you are trying to colonialize us. It's the same song as in the past centuries. You always want to say to us what we can be and what we can do. This is a political problem, in my opinion. It is not to be undervalued, because I think that this problem, even though perhaps with different words, that we will find this problem of the contrast between the most developed countries and the not yet so developed countries, and the accusation of a new colonialism, that we will find this contrast and the connected questions with it more and more in the meetings over the problem of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gianluigi. I request both Professor Clammer and Professor Anitra, if it is all right, to kindly take a little note. Because of the paucity of time, we wish to hear a few more voices, and it is in that spirit. And the friends I request them to kindly take 1 or 2 minutes. And then, so I request Sudha, please. I request these names, you kindly get ready. Sudha, and then Dr. Sanghamitra Patnaik, Minati, Jagajyoti, Bhakti, Randhir, and Devendra. So, Sudha, please. Hello, Sudha, kindly unmute yourself. Okay, as Sudha is taking time, Sanghamitra, please, Dr. Sanghamitra Patnaik. Okay, Minati, hello. Please. Hello.
Good evening, Ananta, Professor Ananta, and good evening, all of you, and namaste. That's a very enriching session. I was about to type on the chat box about my observation that climate issue can only be addressed when human beings in general will partner with nature, irrespective of their membership of any country, like developed or developing countries. So this is what actually the ethics of our protecting the nature and preserving its sustainability. So thank you so much for this enriching session, and we'll be looking forward for this particular type of deliberation in the future. Thank you so much, Ananta, and thank you so much, Professor Randhir and Anitra, Professor Anitra and Professor John Clammer. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Dr. Patnaik teaches in a very important university. And I think one action pathway is to link students to these kind of ideas. I hope you would bring some of these thoughts. and possible collaboration between Professor Anitra and your university. It is called KIT University, which
Yes.
is an important faculty of science, art, and thank you. And now
I would be
Minati.
glad. I would be glad to invite Professor Anitra and John Clammer once he was there with us. So we will be very shortly collaborating with you through Professor Ananta Giri, and we will be going for that particular deliberations. Thank you so much.
And now Minati, please.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. We were actually, this is very deeply enriching and knowledgeable session by Professor Anitra and as well as John Clammer also. We have been listening many, I mean, Ananta bhai also knows, like in Fireflies also, we just discuss these things at a time, 2-3 days like that. So I was just thinking when John Clammer was telling about there is a social issue like how to bridge the gap between 3 C's. Like I was thinking how we can bridge the gap between comfort, consumption, and concern. Whether I don't know whether we will be able to discuss a little bit about this. So I request Ananta bhai today. Saroj is also listening with me. He is also means very. He loves this ecological issues. So he also has to say something. Do we have permission to give him for 2 minutes? 1 minute?
Yes, yes, certainly, please.
Yeah, I can tell.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. This session has been very enriching, and I just wanted to add 2-3 points, like the impact of humans on the ecology can be dramatically changed if we change our food habits. Just reducing the meat eating can have some impact, but there is another thing which we can do is we can rely on foods that we get instead of getting that from the shrubs or the grass type plants. Instead, you should rely more on the trees. So like you should eat more fruits, and even for the staples, we can go for even things like butterfruit. So that will have a big impact. And another thing is we can also eat more fish. And as Professor Anitra was saying, we can also eat seaweeds. Then change in lifestyle, definitely that is also another thing which we can. There is another thing is consumer behavior. Like we need to be intelligently selecting our foods and the resources that we consume. It should not be solely from economic point of view. We should also think from the environmental point of view while selecting our clothes. Like we should go for only cotton and other ecologically less damaging clothes. And similarly for food also similar thing. Like we should go for more sustainable foods. I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Saroj Babu. And so then Jagat Jyoti, please. Jagat Jyoti Tapu Bhai. Hello, Jagat Jyoti. Okay, he's taking some time.
मुझे भाई मार्केट रे होती बे कोई करूँ
Oh, ठीक है. And now Bhakti, please. Bhakti. Okay, Bhakti is taking some time. So Randhir, please.
Thank you so much, sir. And it was very insightful session, very deep presentations by Professor Anitra, and very insightful presentation by John Clammer. I want to share my screen for a minute, and I have to say something, but I want you to to draw a kind attention towards this picture. So this picture spells out the story of deforestation of mind. And I think this picture has a deep meaning. And with the advent of this colonial study, or the study which teaches us to humiliate nature for that matter. Particularly, if you see this picture, in this picture, a man is surrounded by man-made part of environment and animals whom a man is used for his needs. Nature is made for her use, but man try to control the nature for the utility of his material want. However, the fact that man's control over nature does not affect the man's control of man. Sorry, nature controls of man. So the main cause of environmental degradation is the application of deforestation of mind. You can see massive consumption led us to shortage of resources. Population is not the problem. Redistribution of wealth is a problem in that sense. So in that sense, the deforestation is putting pressure on animals to live outside to their natural environment. Biodiversity is affected, agriculture exploitation, cattle farming, oil or gas installation, hydroelectric dams, so on and so forth. So my question is, if you have talked about to sensitize a student. When it comes to sensitization, the first thing that a student asks is that, okay, I want to do this thing, but it is very difficult to make them unlearn about environmental degradation. They have already learned a kind of unsensitized attitude towards nature. So of course, our education system is struggling, to sensitize for that matter. Of course, if you see the global warming, the greenhouse effect is a theory that was first described in 1896. But only in 1960, the rise of environmentalism and ecology, made this a specific issue. And somehow, with the rise of environmentalism, we at least try to, symbolize that we are sincere and we are we have to do something for our future. So my question is how to inculcate sensitivity among the student, among the people, so that they can, aware about. Of course, we can sensitize programs, and we also run some program in NGOs, but that is only the token program. People don't internalize in that spirit. So my question is how to inculcate that spirit of consciousness that make them to become activists, not just expert of environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Randhir. And we have some new friends, for example, Priti Kumar and Dr. Bhadi Bukarashi, Dr. Bhadi Bukarashi, Dr. Linkhoi. So I invite you to kindly share your thoughts, if possible, in a minute each, please. Okay, if you are taking time, then Devendra, please. Dr. Devendra Tiwari. And we have Sudha, just 1 minute, Sudha here. Sudha, after Dr. Tiwari, I invite you to kindly share your thoughts also. Sudha is a grassroots activist and a friend of ours.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for giving me the opportunity. And I would like to appreciate the presentation by Professor John Clammer and then Professor Anitra it was means on same topic, and we were provided with the opportunity to listen to great experts dealing with different approaches, and collectively it made a compact body of knowledge, and it was mesmerizing. So I'm thankful to the distinguished speaker of the day. First of all, I'm remembering some lines of Professor John Clammer, particularly. Sir said the key problem of climate change is our economy. Of course, our economy, be it economy of Indian people or European or African or people of all over the world. So in another context, I would like to express my thanks to Professor Giri as well, because sir started his deliberations by quoting the opinion of Indira Gandhi in one of the conference in 1972 at Stockholm on environment, world environment. So the concern of all over the world is how to save the world from pollution, from depletion or any kind of the issue. So at that juncture, definitely many discussion has been done, and we are aware that our problems, although we are sitting at different corner of the world, but our problems are same. To point out few, Great Smog of London, 1952. Even recently, ongoing pandemic and COVID-19 has affected everybody. It has not spared any single nation or any single continent of the world. So when our issues are same, and definitely we all are men, we all are human beings. So I would like to quote one of the statement of Indira Gandhi in that conference, and allow me to quote. I quote, "The environmental crisis that the world faces today will affect one and all equally. No country, big or small, can escape the after effect of pollution. So it becomes imperative that nations come together, examine their national policies, and review their international policies. A worthwhile policy can be framed based on the concepts that there is one earth and one environment and one humanity. This awareness will lead to greater cooperation among nations to come closer vice environment. Resources can be pooled and cost shared to save the world from an imminent ecological disaster." So really today's talk was one of the initiative as per the vision and suggestion of former PM of India, Mrs. Indira Gandhi. Yes, now Professor Anitra and then Professor John Clammer and various participants and discussants, we have created an awareness, and definitely in days to come with this sensibility. And I would like to also express my thanks to Professor Randhir Gautam, who said how only theoretical awareness is not sufficient. How to encourage the people to move ahead and practically try their best to remove these ecological problems or environmental problems. So really it is an initiative, and I'm happy to be part of this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Devendra. And now Sudha, please. Sudha.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Can you hear Ananta? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. And I must thank you, Professor Gautam, Professor Anitra, and Professor Clammer for a wonderful, very insightful and thought-provoking dialogues. I totally agree with all of you, but in one way, I try to emphasize a little more on what Professor John Clammer has mentioned at the end, is about mainly it is, ultimately it is social and ecological justice and human rights. This is something which we should not, never forget. It never, should not come out of our mind, first of all, because what we have gone through all these years when we started talking about environmentalism, and later, all these COPs, the process started at the global level as well as at the national and the grassroots level. Something, what is that we are missing out? And if you look at even that the UN, recently the United Nations Secretary General, in his agenda, the common agenda, something else is there. He mentioned a new approach. It's not really a new approach. Kind of is a corporate-centric approach. He has highlighted that. It's more than multilateralism. It is more of a multi-stakeholderism. This is something we really need to keep in mind. What is that going to, in the future? And who are the players? Who are the stakeholders? And one way we have seen, and we have been seeing, and we are, in fact, in all our countries, what is that, the corporate or business as usual, even when it comes to whether it's climate, whether it is comes to economy or poverty, whatever you talk about, it is always the solutions are going towards, what is that, corporate centric driven approach. It's a business. It's always business. Even green economy is business. Nothing but is business. So we are not even addressing the whole model itself. One thing, of course, at a personal level, individual level, yes, our ethics, our concern, our practices, our common, humanity, all that is there. But when we need to be political also, that's very important, because see, for me, I've been working at the grassroots. I've been, looking and discussing with our women and with our, children, with our, the communities, especially the tribals, who have been lost almost everything due to the, what do you call that, forest rights. Now, all our, whatever some acts which are right-based laws are there, now they've been getting diluted. Whether in Orissa what's happening. So whatever, wherever it's happening, not only in India, even in Latin American countries, and of course Southeast and South Asian countries, it's gone. It's very painful for me to look at these things. So how we are going to address this system in one way at a personal level, definitely. Of course, we have to take care of our electricity, reduce our consumption. There's not just, we need to reject certain things, not reduce. It's basically you can even reject. Start with rejection, and then the reduce, recycle, reuse, all these things will come later. So, of course, the Gandhian approach, we do have many things, and we do understand, we are practicing at our own personal level. But when you look at that, at a very high, whether it's a national or at a COP level or at a, international level, now it's COP26. What's that going to do? I don't know. I did attend some of this, COP in Paris Agreement. I was also there. In Rio, I was also there. I've seen how the governments take up these things. I observed, and it's, of course, I'm as part of the, people's groups. But that's the pain. How we are going to address this, how these governments are going to, they're not going to come out of the, corporate thing. That the first thing is about the corporate, and is no other solution for them. So no, maybe because though we show many models existing, when we talk about ecosystem, ecological, our own, indigenous systems, how they are working, but they all say that it's all, it's a kind of small ways. But when you come to the larger, and again, of course, as the Professor Clammer said, it's economy, nothing but economics, finally. So this is something which is very challenging, how it is affecting our rights, human rights, humanity. One way, completely destroying the livelihoods and the poor people who have been totally affected, and at the same time rich is becoming richer. So I need not repeat all these things. And where are we at the food security level, and the children going hungry, day by day. So these are the major challenges. I think we need to.
So that we understand.
Yeah, just only one point. Here I come. I differ in only one way. Usually comes that we have to reduce our meat consumption. Fine. I'm fine. Being a middle class, I can reduce my meat consumption. But when you look at the food security or the poor section, there are many. That's the only little meat is giving them a little protein to survive. So my main concern is that if we go on saying that, we have to reduce the meat, I'm not talking about the beef, or I'm not talking about thing. It's fine for those people who are fine enough, at least in the middle class, we can survive. But those who are really on the survival and the survival mode, for them, whatever food is there, let it be there. I mean, that's important. And especially in India, we survive on both. So that's something which I request. I mean, in the, our participants are, I think, to slightly look at this issue, in a different approach. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sudha. So we have had a rich festival of thoughts and concerns. So now I request first Professor Clammer to share his thought, and then Professor Anitra, please. Professor Clammer.
Okay, thank you, Ananta. Well, I think we don't have time to discuss all these issues. You all raise profoundly important questions, but I think some of them group together. So very, very briefly, let me try to answer them. So let me start with Joanne Luigi's point. I mean, in classical religious teaching, I think there are often these teachings about, not managing, controlling nature, dominating nature, or something like this. I mean, my feeling is, though, that I have quite a small shelf full of books, maybe not so small, somewhere in my library, books that people coming from a religious perspective are now really searching for maybe ecological roots or ecological themes in their religion. There's been a shift, I think, profound shift in religious discourse towards much stronger notions of stewardship and responsibility. And I think if you look at the whole question of ethics, it's very difficult to find secular ethics. I mean, almost all ethical systems in one form or another do relate back to their religious roots. And I think that may be a question which religious ethicists or theological ethicists would probably need to work on now to find, what deeper roots in their own religious ethics they can see relating to environmental questions. I mean, the question of whether this whole kind of climate change question is a new colonialism question. I mean, one of the questions it clearly throws up, and it'll be interesting to see if this is discussed in Glasgow, is the question of reparations. I mean, the argument that's coming from some countries that they are largely the victims of climate change, but contributed very, very little, as we know, to the generation of the problem in the first place. Will the wealthy world, in fact, be willing to answer that question honestly and indeed provide the kind of funding and other kind of resources that would, to some extent, answer that question? We will see. It'll be tough, of course, because politically, very, very hot potato, as they say, I think, to grasp that. Other questions. Let me just pick out two or three, because I know we've run over the official time already. I mean, this question of sensitization that Randhir raised, I think Dr. Patnaik was implicitly raising, and so on, is critical. And it's interesting that in a whole range of subjects, including like development studies, one of the weakest approaches actually is psychology. There's almost no psychology of development. It's like, why do people change? Why do people resist change? What sort of mechanisms, in fact, encourage change? And I think that the picture that he showed, actually, I don't know if this was his intention, is an example of something going on here. I think it's well known that people don't respond very well to propaganda. You know, you can lecture people forever about, you know, cut your consumption, climate change is terrible, you know, you have to stop eating meat, don't drive your car, this kind of stuff. They don't pay a lot of attention if you lecture them. Where they begin to pay attention is when you can show them in some form the kind of consequences of whether their actions or of the context which their individual actions are taking place. That relates, I think, to Devendra's question too about taking people beyond just a purely theoretical interest in these questions to converting that into practice. Let me just conclude with a couple of points that perhaps link again one of Randhir's points to a question that Sudha has just raised about, in a sense, this question of social justice. I mean, who are the stakeholders? Everybody are stakeholders, right? This is a universal issue. This is not a question of only experts, you know, being able to determine the outcome of all these critical existential questions for the rest of us. The rest of us have to live with this. When you dig into this question of corporate, I will just raise one further question that a number of you raised about, Randhir was talking about this question of the redistribution of wealth. Now that's a real hot potato. You know, economists love to talk about the growth of wealth, you know, the general growth of the economy. Many conventional economists are very unwilling to talk about redistribution because that is such a politically sensitive question, but probably a critical one in the issue that we're talking about here. So I think that those issues are going to surface. And my last point is this: a number of people have raised this question of finance. I mean, and Anitra raised the question of the financing of these fantastic regenerative projects. You know, the question of how to finance these things. And I just have 2 points to say about that. Notice when the kind of figures that Anitra showed us, that first think, oh goodness, this is so much money, millions and millions of dollars. When you compare them with things like defense budgets, they're not big at all. You know, the amount of money available for these kind of projects is actually quite small relative to the total size of the world economy and the way in which money is misspent on other kinds of projects. It's not the money is not there. It's the question of can it be directed to these purposes. The other thing about finance is this, you know, when economists talk about the economy, very often they don't talk about finance. They don't talk about the role that financial institutions, banks, organizations like the World Bank itself or the IMF actually play in determining many of the kinds of economic outcomes. Finance is critically important, but it tends to hide behind a different kind of economic discourse that we don't notice. That in fact, what pulls a lot of the strings of the world economy is in fact finance or financiers. So in talking about corporate power in answer to Sudha, it's not only the question of corporations in the sense of, you know, manufacturing corporations, oil companies, fossil fuel extractors. It's also very much the question of the money men who are behind this. I think they are one of the critical actors that need to be interrogated very, very closely in creating that movement towards a much more equitable kind of world system. So thank you all. I haven't really answered a lot of your questions, but thank you there so much. We could talk all night, actually, I think, in trying to answer some of the points you raised. Thank you.
Thank you again. Arigato gozaimasu with the stars in Kyoto and Florida. And in Florida, it is daytime. The sun is blooming. So Anitra, please.
Yes, it's morning. It was very early morning and it was dark. Now it's morning. Yes, I'll begin. I'll answer 3 questions. And I'd like to tell Randhir Kumar that I would love to have that painting. That was a very meaningful painting. But this whole thing of finance, I think, what portion of the finance that's being paid is going toward well-being of peoples? That's a very important question of international institutions such as the World Bank or UNDP. What really is the finance paying for? And my scheme of regeneration, although it's a $250 million, no, it's $250 billion, has about 80% of it going to salaries, particularly of unskilled people in developing countries. So that's going to make lots and lots, generate lots and lots per country of employment. But let me go on to how to make students into activists. I think once you get your hands deeply immersed in the soil or the sediment, you become an activist, something that the soil and sediment teaches you that's mystical, that pours just like hugging a tree. You can't hug a tree and not love the tree. You get your hands dirty in the soil and you suddenly feel that you've come alive, you've rooted yourself in Mother Earth, and Mother is giving back to you. And planting mangrove trees, planting seagrasses is a wonderful experience in interacting with the rest of the earth. And I think students could very well, by active projects, from cleaning up their rivers to planting riparian reeds on the sides of the rivers to planting mangroves on the shoreline, become activists simply by doing. That's to Sangamitra. And I think the dominating nature from Genesis 2, which is about 4,000 years old, and flows into the Christian religion, which is about 2,000 years old, is also reflected in the Muslim religion, is not reflected in all the religions of the world. Some of the religion, such as the indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere, very much felt an interaction between themselves and nature. They would pray to the bear or the buffalo before they would kill it. And they would say, brother, I need to kill you in order to have my family eat for the winter, but please forgive me for killing you. And there were much more interactive religions from our traditions than these one God, one reality religions that have told us that our legal system is fine because if you own this thing, you can mine it, cut the forest down, and do all kinds of horrible things to that piece of property that you own. But eating specific projects, I think you should think protein, and of course fish from the restored mangroves or the restored seagrass or the restored coral reef. Fish and cheese are very good sources of proteins, as is the byproduct of the cows, goats, sheep, and so forth. And you don't have to have meat itself. Beans, of course, being a classical Western Hemisphere way of getting protein when meat itself was very short. So I think that's very short answers to very deep questions. And I want to thank you all for asking questions and thank Ananta and the entire group for listening to a rebellion that is beginning to take shape, I think, around the world, which is why do we need to follow like sheep behind the financial systems, which is making the rich grow richer and the poor grow poorer? Why not break free and follow a well-being system that will enhance all of us, our communities, our neighbors? Thank you.
Thank you, Anitra. And before Devendra presents a quick vote of thanks, let us move into the kind of pathway that both John and Anitra have suggested. How do we be with our art? And Minati has kindly offered to present a poem called The Art. Minati, please.
Hello, yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
1 minute, you can put on your video. At least Anitra has not seen you, she can see you.
Yeah. Yeah, hello. So the poetry It's Earth. I think previously also once I had read, but today to give into the occasion, so this will be the appropriate one. So I'm reading it again. The title is Earth. Earth, the bearer of all living beings, the provider, nurturer of every cell in us. Earth is the bearer of all living beings, the provider and nurturer of all every cell in us. Earth, the donor of beautiful azure sky, meadows, vast blue oceans, the waves, clouds, and joy. Earth, the sufferer, been rendered barren, raped, maimed. Can you listen to her pain? Earth, the survivor is not dead yet, even though choked, unable to breathe by our thoughts and by our thoughtless actions. Earth, the mother, whatever she gave, we must share, discarding the greed, reduce, reuse, and recycle, make every day an Earth Day to show you care. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Minati. And now Devendra, please, very quickly.
Thank you so much, sir. And at this juncture, it's my proud and privilege to extend this vote of thanks. Now, on behalf of School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Raffles University, Neemrana, Swadhyay Sahachakra for Creative and Co-Learning, Vishwanidham Center for Asian Blossoming, Puducherry and Chennai, and Raise Global Foundation. First of all, I express my deep felt gratitude to our distinguished speakers of today's session and all the discussants, participants from bottom of my heart. I would also like to express my deep felt gratitude to Honorable Justice Meena V. Gombar, the former Chief Justice of Rajasthan, as our chief patron and for giving us freedom to organize such kind of activities. I'm thankful to Professor Diwakar Goli, the president of Raffles University. I also express my deep felt gratitude to Deepika Dave, the CEO of Raise Global Foundation. I would like to express my gratitude and thanks to first distinguished speaker of the day, Professor John Clammer, and the way sir presented his concepts and experiences related to the very topic was mesmerizing and very informative. And particularly while concluding, sir suggested a solution of these ecological and environmental issues in form of indicating that structural solution can be one of the way by which these issues can be degraded. So Professor John Clammer, my gratitude and humble thanks to you. Next, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Anitra, ma'am, for being initially ma'am accepted that ma'am is a revolutionary. Of course, ma'am has created a revolution of thought in form of depicting so many her personal experiences, particularly showing us the aquaculture and her real first-hand experience with that, and particularly concluding her opinion by saying you can't eat money, you can't breathe money, was very striking. So definitely, ma'am, we are grateful to you. Kindly accept my thanks. Thank you so much. Next, I would like to express my thanks to Professor Gyan Luigi, as usual, very active and raising relevant queries and questions. I also would like to express my thanks to Professor Sangmitra ma'am for being a very active discussant and raising very relevant issues. Ma'am, thanks. I would like to express my thanks to Minati Pradhanji and particularly Saroj Babu sir for raising his concern. It was great. So thank you both of you. I would like to express my thanks to Professor Sudha Reddy ji for expressing her opinion. Moving ahead, it is my privilege to express my deep felt gratitude to Professor Anand Giri, the moderator, and means a link between all the discussions. So, sir, my deep felt gratitude to you. Kindly accept my thanks. Last but not the least, I would like to express my thanks to Professor Randhir Gautam, being the convener and organizing everything in a very perfect way. So thank you everybody from all over the world for being the part of this event. It's our honor to express our thanks. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anitra. Thank you, John. Thank you, Minati. And